Welcome to my living room, Anastasia. How are you?
Thank you, Ross.
I'm glad you could come over. It's been so long since I've seen you. How have you been?
Doing very well, keeping busy.
I bet.
I'll tell you why in a minute.
So you and I have been long friends, and you and I know each other. But since we have people that are listening in, why don't you tell us who you are?
Thank you so much. So my name is Anastasia Vynnychenko, and I lead IOM's Migration, Business and Human Rights program here in Southeast Asia. IOM is a United Nations agency with a global mandate for migration, and my sort of expertise is really here in Asia, and also working since over 10 years, I believe now, with our private sector partners, corporates, M&Es, suppliers, but also labor recruiters, to advise them, build capacities, deliver training on migrant workers and their vulnerabilities, social impact program, ethical recruitment of migrant workers, and also strategies and mechanisms around grievance mechanisms and remedy. So that's, in short, a little bit about me, but yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit more about IOM and sort of what we do. And how this is also relevant for your work.
So you mentioned the core of what you do is migrant labor and human rights. Bringing it down to the factory, the farm, the field, what are the trends in migrant workers that you see today?
So probably I'll start a little bit globally with some of the numbers, but of course behind all the numbers are humans and the human stories. So globally, the latest estimates show us that there are 281 million international migrants. Slightly over half, about 52% are men, and 48% are women. Very, very important to note that majority of people, about 169 million, move for the purpose of employment, right? So they're migrant workers, in fact. And as you said, they work in the stores, they work in the field, they work in private households, in factories, and really do essential work. We've seen this during COVID-19. They were still delivering food to our tables, providing healthcare services. So there are numerous documented benefits that migration brings, both to people who migrate, to their families, but also to the countries of destination and their countries of origin. In part through remittances, so very, very tangible financial mean, and in fact remittances grew from about 128 billion in 2000 to 831 billion in 2022.
So when you say remittances, what do you mean by that?
Money that migrants send back home, right, to support their families, to start entrepreneurship, to invest in their housing, in education of their children.
To pay debts?
To pay debts as well, yes, in a lot of ways, especially when we start talking about recruitment. A lot of that potential is actually sometimes being lost because, in fact, migrant workers have to pay excessive fees to get the job. And that, I think, is also quite important for social compliance audits, because what we often see that recruitment stage, that deployment stage, is not sufficiently covered. And that's where forced labor risks already start happening. And again, the global data shows that migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be exploited, and it's the private sector that is accountable for 86% of exploitation in supply chains.
So I want to follow up on that. So you were talking about how migrant workers come to get their jobs. But if I'm auditing within, let's say, a factory, within the 4 walls of the factory, that happens outside of the 4 walls of the factory. So how do I get to that pre-employment stuff?
Well, that's an excellent question. And critical here would be, of course, to engage directly with migrant workers on site. And here, of course, you'll face a lot of challenges because there will be many nationalities, many cultures, many languages. So it will be very critical to find a way to engage with these groups. And something that we as AOM also have been looking at, recognizing sort of this gap and challenge, as some previous speakers mentioned, it's time and money. Very often it's simply just on site, but for migrant workers it's also life abroad, it's their accommodation, right? It's their access to different services and that critical recruitment stage. So what we've done is we've also developed a diagnostic tool that we call labor migration process mapping, which I think later on you'll see on screen, so I do invite you to download and have a look at it. which essentially retraces the worker steps all the way to their communities. It also strongly advises to engage with labor recruiters to understand the system in place, and then sort of based on that to build a journey into the workplace. And so what we are seeing that indeed a lot of the risks start already in the community, right, where there's a lot of sub-agents and then formal labor recruiters that start charging fees. And if that happens, most likely what you will find then during social audit is things like excessive overtime, passport retention, limited freedom of movement, indebtedness, abuse of vulnerability. So most of ILO forced labor indicators, because for migrant workers that is all very much interlinked. So it's quite critical to have an approach in the workplace to interview these migrant workers. And allow me to also add in terms of methodology and technique in terms of these interviews. What we've seen as well, sometimes being on site and engaging with some of the partners to understand these journeys and to help them map them out, is that migrant workers struggle to sort of explicitly answer a standard set of questions. Did you pay fees? How much? Can you give us a breakdown? For them, they very often don't know. It's a lump sum because the sub-agent in the community tells them, you pay me this, I get you the job, right? $5,000, $2,000, sometimes $10,000 to get a job in Japan, for example, again, some of our data shows. So what we've been also sort of piloting as an approach is participatory action research, where bringing migrants and allowing them to tell about their journeys in their own way, in the way they understand it, in the way what happened, gives you much more understanding of the root causes. And only when you understand the root causes, then you can provide recommendations that would systemically address this and provide sustainable solutions.
So are you suggesting that if I'm an auditor and I'm talking to a migrant worker, instead of saying, you know, what did you pay for this and tell me how you got here, you're suggesting a more open-ended style of asking the questions?
Yes. You will have migrant workers coming from all sorts of backgrounds, educational level, literacy. So allowing them through methods like drawing, role play, a little bit more of a creative to exactly do that, to tell it in their own way, then we're seeing that much more comes back. It could also be not necessarily individual interviews, but a combination of individual, also talking to unions, if there are unions that have migrant workers on site, also talking to civil society organizations that represent voices of these migrant workers, then gives you a much better picture of understanding really what that means for a migrant worker and from a human-based perspective.
So one challenge that I faced when I was running social compliance audits is if I'm in a facility doing work and I have migrants from different countries or different religions, different ethnicities, how do I organize those interviews? Do I bring them all together as one, or do I separate them by where they came from or how long they've been here? How do I put that together?
So internationally, the best practice talks, of course, about speaking to the worker at minimum in their languages, right? Ideally, of course, you'll have someone from their culture, and that's, again, a way to get creative to go about it. Of course, if the auditors have that capacity in-house, fantastic. But there are also ways, so it's all about preparation and preparing that assessment team. In most of the countries, at least here in Southeast Asia, you will have a lot of civil society organizations working on the ground that you can engage with, partner with, right? Get that expertise. They also engage with migrant workers on a daily basis. So they also know cultures and really understand very well how to talk to them. I was very pleased to have a gender expert on a previous panel because also gender aspects of these exercises are absolutely critical. What we're seeing women migrant workers face increased vulnerabilities, right? Because they're migrants and because they're women. So it's also very important to have an interviewer of the same gender. And I'll just give you one example. So we're also observing when it comes to exploitation of, say, excessive overtime in the workplace, For women, there is also increased risk of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, isolation, especially in sectors like agriculture, right, where sometimes sort of the location, the fields are far out, and accommodation is far out. So that increases that risk. So it's also quite important to prepare.
See, this happens every time. This happened 3 times yesterday.
We'll manage. To prepare the interview team to, because just again, as one example, we were just talking earlier about this. If you simply ask, have you been, for example, sexually harassed? Again, we here understand what the term means. For migrant workers, that they very often don't even understand that questions, like what does that even mean? So part of this could be essentially, either doing this individually or a little bit in a group setting and sort of opening it broader, not about your experience individually, but rather perhaps about your observations in the workplace, right? Vis-a-vis managers to worker women, or if you've seen other women harassed or abused. So just open up that conversation and talk. So I just really wanted to highlight the importance of gender responsiveness in interview techniques as part of that social audit.
So you just hit on a good point. What you said was, don't ask women, have you been sexually harassed? You're saying a little bit more of a 360-degree approach. Tell me what you see in the factory that may happen to other people, and don't make it about them. In that, using that technique, you get better responses?
In a way, yes, could be better, but also it's about protection considerations. Nobody wants to re-traumatize a person. So that's why that preparation of the assessment team, onboarding of assessment team, training of assessment team, or engaging experts to do these interviews, then really gets you much better information and, again, understanding of the root causes and really what happens in the workplace, at the accommodation site.
Okay. So, again, when I was auditing, and we came up with migrant workers, or faced with migrant workers, one of the things that I always sort of wondered was, if I'm in, for example, India, if I'm in China, and if I'm in South India and people are from the north, or if I'm in a city and people are from rural, I know you're the international organization for migration, but do I treat workers from within a country from different parts the same way as I would as if someone went from Myanmar to work in Taiwan?
Yeah. Well, the short answer would be yes. And I think you also sort of hit the nail here right away, talking about such countries as India, where you also have so many different regions, so many different languages, right? Almost differences in cultural differences. So in a lot of ways, the risks would be very similar. To move, it's associated with cost, right? You will still need to very often engage with official or unofficial labor recruiter. It's still the costs for transport. It's about accommodation, living expenses. So in a lot of ways, the risks are similar. Of course, if you moved countries and jurisdictions, you add on top of that immigration law, visa law, which for internal migrant workers are not sort of that relevant, but for internal migrant workers or domestic migrant workers in countries like Vietnam and China and India, I'm actually not sure, you also have a lot of limitations in terms of access to services, right, because of very often of the registration in a certain locality. So, for example, they cannot bring their kids with them because there will be challenges with accessing kindergartens or school. Often supplier or employers don't provide that sort of childcare on site. Limited access to healthcare services, limited social insurance access. So a lot of these challenges domestic migrant workers also face in the same way that international migrant workers face. So that's why sort of the tools we've been developing, they can be applied in the context of both international and domestic migration, but of course they've been also designed and developed so that the practitioner, the user, can then tweak them and adjust the set of questions to make it exactly relevant for either international context or domestic.
You've mentioned labor agencies a number of times, and I know that there have been some efforts both at a national level and an international level to begin to certify labor agencies, to say that if a facility hires a company to bring in migrant labor, that they are certified to have done it in a way that meets ethical and legal obligations. Is that work that the IOM has been doing? Can you talk more about that?
Yes. In fact, IOM has been promoting the IRI standard, which is the International Recruitment Integrity System, which I think is referred to very often as very high and golden standard in terms of ethical recruitment. It has been really, really a challenge, particularly because we're talking about certification of an actor in a supply chain that has the least leverage, right? So what needs to, of course, happen is matching of the supply and demand. So, and that is something that after, I think, 10 years of a lot of companies committing to employer-based principle, leadership group for responsible recruitment, many other initiatives, still struggling because there is still a lack of supply for ethical recruitment services. Whereas at the same time, everybody is looking for kind of a quick fix and solution. Well, give me the list of certified recruiters. And that's just simply not their reality at the time. So what, again, we're strongly advocating for is that supply chain collaboration, promoting shared responsibility, right? And we've seen some good examples where, you know, after the labor migration process mapping, understanding the root causes, understanding the role of recruiters, we've seen some buyers revisiting their service agreements with labor recruiters, or maybe even sometimes dropping, say, a labor recruiter in a destination country and partnering directly with the recruiter in the origin country. There are a couple of recruiters that are certified, and good example also in the context of industry. So for example, Responsible Business Alliance that has a group of members that are also adhering to ethical recruitment principles. There are good examples of pilot initiatives with zero fee recruitment, right? That then shows great impact on migrant workers because there is no debt. And that ultimately triggers also less risk in terms of other forced labor indicators. So sort of this collaboration will be critical across supply chain, but also across multi-stakeholder groups. Because a lot of things, or issues rather, with regard to fees and costs are actually a regulatory issue. Most of the countries here in Southeast Asia, by law, allow fee charging to migrant workers. They often set the cap. There is an increased effort to provide breakdown on fees and costs, but almost none of them explicitly prohibits it. And then again, when it comes to social compliance audit, it's a question of what's my legal liability. Whereas what we promote mostly is this more of a proactive approach, compliance with a higher international standard to prevent. And I think in the context of mandatory human rights due diligence laws, that will be very critical for companies to demonstrate what action they take to prevent this from happening in the first place.
So it's really interesting that you ended on HRDD, because hot off the presses, the Council of the EU approved a regulation just 2 days ago preventing the import of goods into the EU made in whole or in part with forced labor. Now, it will take time for those regulations to come into effect, but the EU is now following the US on preventing that, and what I'm hearing is migrant workers, if they're not treated properly, could be an indicator of forced labor.
Yes. Yes, and we've seen that. I think most of you will be familiar with US Customs and Border Patrol withhold release orders, which I think in the last 4 or 5 years have been quite a good tool for companies then to provide remedy to these migrant workers. And in a lot of ways, the forced labor, we say rubber glove manufacturers in Malaysia and others, have been because of migrant workers, because forced labor was found primarily among these groups. So what companies have done, of course, is looked to repay these workers, which is very important because it's a tangible remedy that migrant workers need, which alleviates their debt pressure. However, what we're also not seeing, and that's probably will be sort of a little bit my challenge to us to think about this, and also to the companies, and for you mostly to be aware of, is then again, what needs to happen for the companies to just stop going in this vicious circle and repay, but rather, again, take a little bit more of a systemic look and look at understanding the root causes of why these issues are happening and sort of take more of these different sustainable solutions. And that will require a lot of work, a lot of engagement with rights holders, and a lot of multi-stakeholder engagement as well.
So you will.
Here you go. We've got this. People need a coffee break.
Yeah, really, we're done. Go have a drink. So I wanted to follow up on that last point. Is you were talking about root cause analysis and education and all of that sort of stuff. In my experience, I've worked with suppliers and facilities. They just don't know. And you would refer to, hey, it's legal in this country, or it may be in the home country, where the factory is, it may be acceptable. So I think it's easy to say, well, just root cause analysis, but how do I know what the right thing to do is? How do I know why it's the right thing to do, and what resources would be available if I'm a brand or if I'm an audit firm to say, hey, here's what this issue is, and here's how I think you can learn more about it?
I think this is an excellent question, but also a very challenging one, right? Because I think there is a lot of information and reports out there. We're just one organization, leading in this space in migration, business, and human rights. So we provide a lot of awareness raising. You'll also outside, I welcome you to take some of the reports we've produced. One is particularly interesting. It's called What Does the Future Hold for Labor Migration in Southeast Asia, which looks at predictive analysis for the next decade based on the trends in the past decade of mobility in the region. Something we're also working on probably the next few years is to make data on risks, analysis of regulatory frameworks, guiding labor migration in the region under our program, to make it a bit more publicly available so that that data can inform companies' human rights due diligence, but also practitioners like yourselves to prepare when you go to a specific country to understand risks better. And I'll just give you one example. Myanmar and latest developments with coup there. Now what we are observing is a huge increase of irregular migrant workers in Thailand, because that's #1 destination historically for migrant workers from Myanmar. So companies are still looking at the risks when they recruit from Myanmar, when in fact the workers they have in their suppliers in Thailand are already in Myanmar in a lot of ways in a regular status. So that's a completely different risk, and you need to understand that and to know that these data and these different trends. So again, for example, if you are in a factory setting, understanding what the workforce composition is and understanding what events might have sort of impacted specific risks to specific nationalities that are there in that country. There we go.
When you said regular versus irregular migration, what does that mean?
So I think it's a little bit more ethical term to talk about legal, illegal, because people can't be legal, illegal. So regular migration, right, when you move through proper channels, through proper pathways with proper documentation. Irregular can happen in both ways. So smuggling, right, people into the country, so already, or getting into the country, say, through a tourist visa, when that country of destination doesn't allow converting visas, or sometimes moving completely legally, regularly, through proper channels with a proper contract, but then the employer cancels your contract. For example, if you complain, but your work visa is tied to that specific employer, and that's the case in Malaysia and in a few other countries. So then you find yourself in an irregular status, and very often can still continue working without a contract. And then it also becomes home affairs, immigration enforcement issue, because very often these laws are sort of tied together in countries of destination.
Following up on, I swear, this is, all right, I have a bad mojo today. So you followed up on, I want to follow up on something that you said. One of the things I think auditors sometimes struggle with is keeping up, like laws change, you don't know when they change, or there may be global issues that occur, and how do I know that they occurred, and how do I know if that may impact what's going on in the factory? And bringing it down to migrant workers, you had mentioned, hey, there may be some global issues that could impact migrant workers appearing in the field, in the farm, in the factory. Can you give us some examples of what that is?
Some of the issues.
Yeah, some of those current events.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, we call them migration drivers, right? So what drives, so pushes or pulls people in, and something that we also mentioned in the report, so things like conflict or natural disaster. So you can absolutely anticipate movement, either within borders or across borders, right? So people fleeing floods or typhoon in the Philippines, for example, earthquake in Nepal that displaced a lot of people. Again, the situation and conflict in Myanmar. So that is something to look out for. Also do the analysis of demographic trends and labor shortages in different countries. Japan, I think since the past 10 years, has been pursuing more and more liberal and open migration policies because of huge acute labor shortages at all skill levels. Similarly, even countries like Malaysia and Thailand, that are also net receiving countries, have had their population peaked. So these countries are slowly starting to age, right? Whereas also to see different trends in terms of where companies move their production, also because of different political developments. So that's something to also watch out for. So probably like a few examples of this. Well, climate change as well, right, is going to drive people. Major events or major construction projects. So one example, again, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going to host 2030 World Expo, 2034 World Cup. So ultimately, country that's already hosts millions of migrant workers, we can anticipate that sectors like construction, services is going to draw, hospitality is going to draw more migrant workers. So again, when it comes to audits, I think this is something that to be aware of in the context of migration and increased vulnerabilities and potential risks.
So we have almost 500 people online, auditors listening in right now. We've talked a lot, local, global, all these trends. What are one or two takeaways that social compliance auditors could use the next time they're in a facility looking at migrant workers?
So I think preparation would be key. So coming back to this last point. Also really engaging with migrant workers and finding a way that would work best for social auditors, but also for companies and, of course, the budgets that are available for these exercises. Really try and talk beforehand to some of the civil society organizations and trade union expert organizations in the location where social audit is being conducted. Have a look at APSCA's open resource page. We're also very pleased now to be collaborating and sharing some of our resources on your page. So that's a very useful source to prepare. And probably lastly, to make sure to understand all these different trends, just again to be aware of.
So you had mentioned a number of tools that the IOM is developing. How do I get my hands on those tools?
So first, I don't know if they're going to be put up here with QR codes, with trying to be tech savvy and print less. So you can access them through QR codes. If not, we have a website, mbhr.iom.int, where there is a whole section with resource page. So again, you can access them. Perfect. QR code is there. So you can access here. You can access through the web page. They're open source. They're very interactive online. And then also please get in touch with us if there is an interest to learn more, if there is an interest to potentially do some training, some engagement. Also together with APSCA, we hope to maybe explore some joint awareness raising opportunities. I do invite you to also have a few copies of reports just outside at the registration. And also I'm happy to stay for a little bit during coffee break and discuss a little bit more.
I couldn't have ended it better myself. Everyone, Anastasia Vynnychenko. Thank you.